Hello everyone, welcome to Pro Kids Coding School, and this is our first course which is Python for kids and beginners. And in this video we want to share you the different topics that we will be covering as part of each of the lessons. So let's get started. Thank you. Lesson 1 talks about introduction to software programming, and in this lesson so we have various topics like the introduction to programming, then the basics concept of programming, and we will be discussing about the need for the different programming languages, and then we will give some overview about the introduction to programming languages, and then we will dive into the introduction to programs and then the coding process. So pretty much these topics we will be covering as part of our lesson 1. In lesson 2 is more of introduction to Python. So what we will be having topics like what is Python and why we need to learn Python and the features of Python. So we will be discussing about the various features of Python, and then we will focus on the installation of both Python as well as the IDE. So here we are trying to use PyCharm as our IDE, and then once the installation done, we will be connecting on the first. We'll write the first program, and then we will also deal some simple math operation programs like addition, subtraction, and multiplication. So that's all pretty much for the lesson 2. Lesson 3 is more of variables. We will be having topics like what is data and information. So before diving into variables, we need to know what is data and information, and then we will be diving into why do we need data in coding, and then we will see topics like variables and why the name variable and why we need variable and what does a variable have and how to create variables, and then we will deal with like assigning values to variables, and we will see the different we'll see some basic data types in variables. And the 10th topic would be like using variables in our arithmetic operations, and then printing variables, updating variables, and input and variables. So these are pretty much the topics we will be covering as part of lesson 3, which basically deals with variables. So lesson 4 we will be focusing on data types. So we will start with what is a data type and why we need data types in coding, and then we will discuss about some basic numbers like integers and floating point numbers, and then we will focus on strings and booleans, and we'll do some type conversion. So that's all about lesson 4. So in lesson 5, so we'll be focusing on the Python operators. So we will give a first an introduction to Python operators and why we need operators, and then we'll focus on the different types of operators like arithmetic operators, comparison operators, logical operators, assignment operators, and then finally we will discuss on like the order of operations. So these are the topics we will be covering in lesson 5. So lesson 6 is all about control flow. So where we will talk about the conditional statements and loops, and in conditional statements we will cover order conditions, and we will be touch base the if statement, else statement, and elif statement. And in loops, we will focus on the for loops and while loops and how to break out of the loops and skipping the iteration. So these are the topics we will be seeing in learning in lesson 6. So in lesson 7 we will be covering data structures. So we will be covering like lists, tuples, dictionaries, and sets, and in this data structures what we will be learning is like how we can create and access them, and how we can iterate these data structures, and how we can add and update items to it, and we'll see some basic methods on each of these data structures. So that's pretty much for the data structures for lesson 7. And in lesson 8, we'll be focusing on functions. We will see we have topics like creating functions, built-in functions, and scope. And what we'll be learned here, like we'll go to the introduction to functions and defining and calling a functions and parameters and arguments. We'll talk about return values, and then we will learn about the various Python built-in functions, and then we'll talk about the local versus global variables. So these are pretty much we cover in our lesson number 8. Lesson number 9 is more about the object-oriented programming, where we will understand the classes and objects and attributes or properties. Then we will learning about the methods or actions, and then we will be discussing the constructor, and we will talk about inheritance, and then we'll go through like overriding methods and encapsulations. So these are the top topics now we will be covering as part of our lesson number 9. These are the topics that we'll be covering as part of our Python for Kids and Beginners course. So stay tuned and contact us for enrolling. Thanks for watching this video and have a great day. Bye bye.